Hey there, Josh here from Squibler, excited to dive into how to create a narrative hook. In this video, we'll be talking about how do you write a good narrative story. Have you ever started writing a story and after reading the first few pages, you feel that this is not as interesting as you thought it would be? So this is often something that happens to you a lot more than once, especially if you're an avid reader. I like to read a book a week, and because of that, I come across all the time. But do you know what actually happened? It means that your story lacked a hook. It wasn't worth continuing to write it. After all, why write something that no one will want to read? Today, we want to talk about this topic that many novice writers ask, and that is, how do you create a good hook for your story? Now, here's the thing. Let's say like 95% of writers, especially those starting their first book, have no idea how to capture their reader's attention from the first page. And this causes them to leave the book a couple of minutes after opening it and never touching that book again. But will this always be the case? And can you change this and make sure that you don't make this mistake? Well, fortunately, writers have at their disposal almost a limitless range of literary sources to use to their advantage to capture the attention of their readers and keep them hooked to their book from beginning to end. The hook is one of the most valuable resources a writer can have, and the one that if you learn to master, it will significantly increase your chances of being a great writer. So as we dive in, make sure to pay close attention to what I'm going to tell you in this video. And with that, I will give you the keys that will help you write a good narrative hook and improve as a writer by mastering one of the most effective literary resources that exist. So first off, what is a narrative hook? Well, every writer wants to tell an intriguing, remarkable, moving, and powerful story that will melt the hearts of readers and send copies of their books off the shelves in a matter of a few minutes. Hey, but not all of us can be Patrick Rufus, right? It's just not the way it works, and it's hard. But why don't the vast majority of writers accomplish this feat? It's simple. Their stories lack literary interests. Although this can be due to many factors, it almost always is due to the lack of one or more narrative hooks. And I'm sure you're wondering, but Josh, what the heck is a narrative hook though? Okay, well, the narrative hook is a resource used by the writer to involve the reader in their story. For a hook to be effective and shocking and engaging and pulling, it must be presented in the first act of the book. And this part of your story will give the reader all the possible details of your history, saving the mysteries and surprises for later. And during the first act, we'll go ahead and put the reader in the perspective of your character. We'll explain in what world your character lives, what their appearance looks like, what moral dilemmas they have and that they're self-conscious about, and more. So the first act is the path that will take us to the first turning point in our history, and that is where the hook comes into play. And I know a lot of this may sound a little confusing, but let's dive into some detail. So what does a narrative hook look like? To give you a clearer idea, imagine that you are a police officer and you have an ordinary life. You have a daily routine and nothing has affected this routine during all your years of career. But then, all of a sudden, you find inside a box something so terrible that words are not even enough to describe the overwhelming feeling that invades you. Shocking, right? That is known as a narrative hook. And if you want to be a great writer, you must master it perfectly and learn when and how to apply it in your story. By the way, the previous example is one of the most used hooks in the crime, suspense, and investigation novel genre. So if you are writing a story of this genre, you already have an excellent example of a shocking hook to set things in motion from the first act. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of narrative hooks. There are many practical examples of hooks and how to use them properly to impact the reader and capture their attention. Another point in favor of hooks is that they trigger important events or scenes that will allow you to design a better structured path for your story. And as we know, structure is so important to making sure you actually write a good story. For example, in the romance genre, the hook can be the appearance of an old love or an unexpected meeting between the main characters. It can even be a betrayal or exchange of glances that lasts for several seconds. Anything that triggers a feeling of anticipation in your readers and makes them think that something is about to happen. Now let's say you want to write a horror book narrative hook. This genre is distinguished by playing a lot with fear in the reader's mind. So depending on the story you are writing, you can take one of those two directions to cause an emotional impact on your audience and leave them wanting it to happen in the following pages of your book. H.P. Lovecraft is known as a master of cosmic horror, and most of his hooks focused on the protagonist discovering chilling truths and encounters with beings beyond human comprehension. And from his recent series actually went live on Amazon, you can see a lot of that and a lot of those visuals come to play. It's super cool. And Edgar Allan Poe played more with the emotions and horror of human existence as a source of all evil. Poe's characters were immersed in highly stressful situations, which generated an immediate moral dilemma for readers, causing a unique and lasting impact that would go throughout the entire story. Now you have a clear idea of how narrative hooks work and why they are crucial to developing a story. If you still have any doubts, don't worry. Usually this concept seems a bit strange at first, but with practice and, of course, patience, you will master this resource and write your narrative hooks that will surprise your readers and motivate them to continue reading your book. Now let's go ahead and get to the main point of this video. I will explain to you how to write a good narrative hook and not get frustrated in that attempt. So that way you can keep writing and you don't run into any writer's block. Now, how do you write a good narrative hook? Well, before we dive into how to write a good narrative hook, let me briefly explain the essential elements that make a good hook. So that way we can take the proper steps to making sure that your output has clarity. Now, the three fundamental factors that must appear for your creative hook to fulfill its objective is the impact on the reader. The first factor is considered by most writers as the most important when it comes to narrative hooks. You have to surprise readers and cause a change in their perception of your story up to that point. In this section, creativity plays a significant role. And don't be afraid to innovate here. As long as your hook does not clash with the main idea of your story, then you have nothing to fear. The best hooks start from unusual situations which make your readers wonder, what would I do in a situation like this? And oftentimes, the best writers try to put themselves in a corner to write those great stories of how to get out of that corner. And a lot of screenwriters do this as well, and they're trained to do this to get the best possible stories out. And we have moment scenario. Timing is crucial for your narrative hook to be effective. While the sooner the hook appears in the story, the better. You can't just throw away what must be one of the best features of your story. You have to know how to create the environment and choose the correct setting so that when your hook appears in the story, it causes an impact on your readers. Let's say, for example, imagine that you write a vampire story. Your hook is the protagonist must protect the vampires instead of hunting them. Up to that point, everything is fine. But then you decide to use this hook in a scene where your protagonist is preparing a toast. The dramatic effect will go down the drain and your hook will simply not generate any emotion in your readers, which will result in them closing your book and throwing it into the garbage. Well, hopefully not. Hopefully they give it back to the library or, they just find a way to reuse it. But often enough, they'll put it aside and they'll just never read it. Think about when to use your hook and make sure it's a perfect time for readers to feel the full effect that will change their perspective on your story. Now let's talk about consequences. So your hook has to be something determining in the story. Otherwise, it is not your hook. Only an incredibly powerful idea that affects the future direction of your story will grab the attention of your readers. Your hook should represent something that will inevitably affect your characters and the story in general for better or worse. It's important to ask yourself, when you're thinking about the narrative hook of your story, you should pose the question, is this important enough to make your story original? How will this idea affect my story? And how will it move it forward? Once you have the answers to those questions, you are ready to write a great narrative hook. And now that you know the essential elements for your narrative hook to be effective, let's go ahead and move on to the actual process of writing it. So if the idea you want to use as a narrative hook meets all the elements that I just mentioned, it should be much easier for you to write that good hook. As unbelievable as it may sound, writing a good narrative hook is really not as complicated as most people think. Although it can be a real headache for a novice writer, the most experienced and talented writers create narrative hooks as easily as let's say, eat cereal. But let's not get ahead of the facts. The chances are you are no Ernest Hemingway, and that does not mean that you cannot create a good narrative hook. However, you can make your readers obsessed with reading every page of your book, and you can still become a great author. So here we have the process of writing a good narrative hook. You want to follow these tips, and you will improve considerably in your mastery of this writing resource. So first is to create an outline of your story in chronological order. This will allow you to have a clear idea of what will happen in your story from beginning to end. When you have your story arranged in this way, you can choose the perfect moment to locate your narrative hook. It's important that you read your outline several times, reorder it if necessary, and highlight the most interesting ideas and use them in combination with your hook to advance your story. Now, I'm sure you may be thinking, do I really need an outline? Yes, you do need an outline. Great writers use outlines. And remember that your hook must have a determining effect on the future direction of your story. And you want to summarize your narrative hook in a paragraph. And then think about how the reader would react to that same paragraph. And an example of this, if your hook is based on the death of a character, you'll want to mention it at the beginning of an important chapter. So that could be, Jane died 10 minutes ago, and when we found out, we knew that everything would change forever. Your readers will immediately begin to imagine the consequences that this character's death will bring. And they'll prepare for that something that will happen in your story's future. So they're not quite sure what it is, but that anticipation is what matters. And you want to be able to distribute your hook throughout the story. If you have a fascinating narrative hook, you don't need to spend it all at once. Use it as a resource, but make sure you use it wisely. You can gradually apply it throughout the chapters of your book. This strategy will allow you to create more subplots. And this is especially useful for books with lots of characters. This way you give each one enough space to shine. And you want to ask your friends and family to read the outline of your story. And ideally people who you trust with their feedback. Many times the opinion of other people can help us discover new scenarios and enrich our story with ideas that would never have occurred to us. Now let's dive into a few more tips for creating a good narrative hook. If you've been struggling for a long time to create a good narrative hook, then follow these tips. Structure your ideas before you start writing. As I mentioned, outline is always the best option here. So there's lots of tools that help you create these outlines online. Squibler is one of them, so I highly recommend you check it out. And you want to look for inspiration in other books of the same genre that you want to write. Many writers do this when they feel creatively blocked. And think outside the box. That idea that you think is too crazy could be the hook you are looking for. An innovative idea that will surprise your readers. And be patient. When you write, you may feel anxious to write a lot of pages and let your creativity flow, but you should not force this process, or you're just simply going to end up exhausting that creative impulse in a couple of pages. It's important to understand that writing is an art, but it's also a science, and that science says that patience can be your best ally. And it says, don't get frustrated. You got to work through it. It's not unusual for you to fail in your first attempts to write a good narrative hook. But you must learn from your mistakes without falling to frustration and self-loathing, and keep beating at the drum. So throughout the history of mankind, the best writers have failed before succeeding. And most people, whether entrepreneurs or writers, fail before succeeding. If you fail, put your head up, try again. That is how it works if you want to get better. Now let's talk about narrative hooks that were a success, so you can have some good inspiration in mind. Here are a couple examples of ones, although applied differently, and they ended up working perfectly. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. So J.K. Rowling addresses us from the beginning with the existence of people with magical powers and their interaction with the world of non-magical people. Before Harry Potter, hundreds of books had been written about wizards. But what made The Boy with the Lightning Bolt Scar so special? Well, this book has a narrative hook from the beginning. So readers have to read the entire book ahead of them to get in love with the exciting and detailed way the author describes a world of magic and wizards. And we have The Shining. Stephen King is a master of narrative hooks, and his novels often have not one, but several narrative hooks masterfully strung together. In The Shining, we gradually immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the Overlook Hotel. By the time the narrative hook is presented, we're already too caught up in the story to stop reading. Now, this is a perfect example of how the narrative hook effect should be distributed throughout the story. Unlike the previous example, King takes his time building momentum and setting the ideal scenario to drop the bomb, per se, on us. The hotel is haunted, and it will be the location of many events that will terrify us. Did you realize how two narrative hooks, so different and applied very differently as well, can be so effective? You don't have to be a writing legend to create a good narrative hook like these. By following these steps, you can significantly improve your writing skills and master this helpful resource. And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can keep up to date with everything writing and become a better writer. And with that said, I'll see you on some of our other videos, and thank you for watching. Cheers.